I want to talk to you this week about contracts. But before we get into this clause that you need, let's do a little housekeeping. First of all, let me say that I am not an attorney. I'm not a lawyer in any way, shape, or form. And you might think, well, why are you talking about contracts? Contracts are more than just a legally binding document. If somebody goes to your website and they see that you have a photo session coming up and it's $250 and this is what you get with the photo session, that is a contract between you and that person. Now, if they show up the day of the shoot and you've decided that you're going to charge them $300, you've broken that contract. Or if they contact you about it and say, oh, well, I just haven't updated the web page and it's really not $250 anymore. Again, you've broken a contract with that person. Again, not a lawyer, so I'm not going to talk about legal binding of the document. I recommend, though, that once you've got your wording done, that you go and hand it to a lawyer to have it checked to make sure that you haven't done anything that for your area won't work. And if you're going to work in multiple areas, you might want to make sure that there isn't anything in any of the areas that you are going to work within that would cause an issue because of wording that's in there and that it's all enforceable. But the clause that I think you need is a clause about generative AI images and videos. Now, I don't know if you've noticed lately, there's been a lot of fake videos made using celebrities. And the fact that people are using celebrities' images without their permission is another whole podcast as far as I'm concerned. But in this case, the latest one was Tom Hanks being used to pitch a dental plan. Now, somebody coming to your studio may rightly be concerned about what their images could be used for if they give you permission. And we'll talk about how I break my contracts down at the end, but specifically, what generative stuff could you use them for? Personally, I am going to say nothing. I am not going to use their image or their likeness in anything that I use for generative AI. And I do use generative AI. The reason I use it is I shoot boudoir photography, and by using a generated image in the pose that I set up, we'll talk about posing in a minute, the image itself can't be tied to a person. So if I've got images that I use for a posing guide, for example, and I want to make sure that that posing guide shows people who are scantily clad, I don't have to worry about violating anybody's trust. I don't have to worry about a contract or anything about that for the simple fact that I am not using a person. But that brings up posing. With generative AI, a pose is a wireframe. So if I were to use a photograph from a session, it would be turned into a wireframe, and the wireframe is what would be used in the generative AI. Now, I haven't had an opportunity to find a pose only that I've done in a session, but I could see that coming up where I might come up with an idea at the time and I want a particular pose. To me, using the position of a body is not the same as using the person. So for me, the generative AI clause would basically be your images will not be used in any generative AI form. And again, you could bring a face across to another image. There's all kinds of things that you could use generatively, and I understand why people would be concerned about the existence of that and want to be comforted by having a clause in the contract that says it will not be used. Now, let me talk about how I structure my contracts. For me, the contract for the session is different than my use. And here's why. If a person's coming to a session, here is what you're going to get for the money that you're paying. If we're going to do an album, if we're going to do wall art, the price of the album and the wall art will be separate from the session and determined at the time that we figure out which images we're going to use, what album we're going to use, what wall art we're going to use, and that can shift. The session fee will not, and the session fee can include hair and makeup done on site before the session. So you understand what you're going to get up front. If we go through the photographs and the client says that there's something there that they would like to use, and again, remember I use a lot of generative AI stuff, so it's more of a portfolio type setup for that than it is a public facing document. But if I were to ask a client to use particular photographs, they would be in a separate contract, again with the clause in there saying they won't be used for generative AI. My contract includes how long they could be used for and for what purpose that image will be used. And the contract is specific to the image or images that will be used, and there's not a general anything from the session type of contract. So the person not only knows what to expect when they come in, but once the images are done and they can see what they look like, they know if images are going to be used, what images are going to be used, and how those images are going to be used, and for how long those images will be used. Now that means that in that initial contract, there is no permission given in that shoot contract for me to use those images in any way. That is only given at the end, and that is only given if the person agrees to it and for specific photographs. Those photographs will be identified in the document that the final contract comprises and that is agreed upon. So that way, everything is clearly set out and defined. I try to keep legal jargon to a minimum, basically because I'm not dealing with a lawyer in a court. I'm dealing with a human being. I think everything should be readable and shouldn't need an interpreter to go through it and figure out what they actually signed. So that's the way I approach contracts. Again, I think with all of the stuff going on with generative AI, it's essential that we make sure that there is a clause called generative AI with it spelled out exactly the reason what we will and will not do. And I can see people being very uncomfortable about having their face used because the face could be mounted on any other image that gets generated. So from my perspective, I am not going to use any part of that person. I'm not going to use their face to train anything. I'm not going to substitute their face over another image that got generated. All of that's off the table in my contracts, and that's the way I approach making sure that my customers are cared for and are protected. And that's what I got for you guys this week, and I will talk to you guys all next week.